find God's power and presence at work through the lives of 5 people to carry out his will. And these 5 people are the main characters of the story. We're going to see a lot of them, so let's get acquainted with them. The first is a king named Xerxes. He was not a particularly nice person to be around. As a matter of fact, you could not be certain of your own future. If you got close to him and then made one wrong step, he was a tyrant. His will was absolute. He held the power of life and death with a nod of his head. He could be generous one minute and vindictive the next. His temper was frequently out of control, and into whose presence it was a crime to come unbidden. The second significant person is Queen Vashti. She did the unthinkable. She refused the king's summons. Although we don't know a great deal about Queen Vashti, we do know that she was a strong-minded, independent thinking woman who was not afraid to go against the wishes of her husband, the king. Xerxes saw this as a rebellion that had to be nipped in the bud. Otherwise, a woman's insurrection might spread throughout the kingdom. Vashti was immediately uncrowned and banished from her position as queen. The third character is Haman, a wealthy and influential officer in the court of the king. In fact, he occupied the next to the highest position in the kingdom. He was a man with a long history of hatred for the Jews. He was also a man who didn't know when to stop. The fourth person of significance in this story is Mordecai, a Jew living in Persia. He was a godly man, and his most significant, the fourth person of significance in this story is Mordecai, a Jew living in Persia. He was a godly man, and his most significant role was his relationship to the fifth and final character of our story, Esther, an orphan Jewish girl, adopted and reared by her cousin Mordecai. A little girl who must have cried her heart out at the death of her parents, bereft and orphaned, yet who years later would become key to the very survival of her people, the Jews. The immortal, invisible, all-wise hand of God is working behind the scenes, hidden from human eyes. Only such a gracious and all-knowing being would have his hand on some forgotten orphan, a little girl who had lost her mother and father. Only such providence would be at work in the life of a lowly Jew living in exile in the land of Persia, where Xerxes ruled in cruel sovereignty and self-serving. There is a beautiful message here for anyone who has ever experienced brokenness, for anyone who has ever been crushed by life, for anyone who has ever felt that his past is so discolored, so fractured, that there is no way in the world God can make reason and meaning out of it. God and God alone can do such things. He, in fact, does do such things, working silently and invisibly behind the events of history. Most of our days begin rather predictably. Day after day, for the most part, we could enter into our diary the same 3 words: no big deal. Days don't begin with divine skywriting. We aren't catapulted into the hours of the morning by some great recognizable movement of God, where we can sense his presence or audibly hear his voice. Angelic choirs don't awaken us with celestial harmony, blending their voices in the Hallelujah chorus. However, days that begin uneventfully can also lead into an unbelievable, indescribable series of heart-stopping experiences. Ordinary days, in fact, can become extraordinary. They can become so different, so pivotal, that they change the entire course of our lives. That is exactly how it happened with Esther. She was an unknown, orphaned young woman whose life had absolutely no connection with the most powerful man in the Persian Empire. Yet God, in his providential tapestry, was weaving these 2 unrelated lives together. With a smiling face, he began it all on one of those ordinary kind of days. King Xerxes was given a banquet There's nothing unusual about that. King's banquets were common among ancient nobility. This banquet, however, was an extravaganza. It went on for 180 days. Can you believe that? We're talking 6 full months of partying, which makes today's celebrity blowouts look like stingy potlucks. It had all the ingredients of a pagan celebration. Loud music, wild dancing, too much eating, drinking in excess, but something important was missing from the scene: the queen herself. She was busy giving a banquet for the women in the palace. By now the king was drunk, and while in his inebriated state, he decided to show off the physical beauty of his queen. But the queen simply said no. In the midst of an unsavory scene, she was brave enough to say no to that which was blatantly wrong. And in resisting this insulting act of indignity, she took a stand against the greatest power in her universe. And I'd say good for her. The queen's refusal enraged the king. To cut to the chase, 4 words will suffice: exit Vashti, enter Esther. What you have to keep in mind is that Esther doesn't have the foggiest idea what is going on. She knows nothing of the events transpiring in the royal palace. She is going about her no big deal business of living her life, greeting the sunrise of each ordinary morning, carrying out the day-to-day responsibilities. Is she in for a surprise? This is the wonder of God's sovereignty, working behind the scenes. He is moving and pushing and rearranging events and changing minds until he brings out of even the most carnal and secular settings a decision that will set his perfect plan in place. We see it throughout the story of Esther. Don't fall into the trap of thinking that God is asleep when it comes to nations, or that he's out of touch when it comes to carnal banquets, or that he sits in heaven wringing his hands when it comes to godless rulers or foolish prime ministers who make unfair, rash, or stupid decisions. Mark it down in permanent ink. God is always at work. But his ways are so different from ours. We quickly jump to conclusions and either react rashly or get paralyzed in panic. As the words of Isaiah remind us, "For my thoughts are not your thoughts, neither are your ways my ways, declares the Lord." Isaiah 55:8. After some time, the king's servants see something happening to their master. He's depressed. He's moping around. He longs for someone to greet him with arms outstretched, someone who will offer words of comfort and understanding, not just a servant or one of his officers eager to please the king, but someone who truly cares for him and his feelings. What would cheer him up? Why not a beauty contest? He ordered his officials to comb all 127 provinces in Persia and bring in every beautiful virgin they could find, and to enhance that beauty with a full year of care with cosmetics. Now, folks, that's a lot of oil. Esther found herself in the king's palace. She accepted it with grace and made the best of a situation she might have preferred to avoid. Esther told no one she was Jewish because that is what Mordecai instructed her to do. She had no driving ambition to be queen. Her life did not revolve around her physical appearance or making a king happy. She was there for one reason, because she knew that the hand of God was on her life, and through circumstances and Mordecai's wisdom, she had been brought to this place for a reason. She knew where she was coming from. She knew who she was. She knew what she believed. And she knew that God's hand was on her life. If it was part of his plan, then she would willingly accept it. If not, she would willingly relinquish it. Now the king had commanded that everyone bow down and pay homage to Haman. As Haman came and went each day between his house and the palace, he passed Mordecai, sitting at the palace gate. Mordecai would not bow down or pay him honor. Probably after many days of being hounded about this, his reply was, "I am am a Jew. I cannot bow down to any earthly being. This made Haman furious. Having learned who Mordecai's people were, his evil mind began to concoct a plan to destroy all the Jews in the kingdom. The king agreed almost casually that on December 13th of that year, all Jews in the Persian Empire would be killed. In the midst of all this, God was not sleeping. In his sovereign plan, he determined one person would make the difference. One individual would stand in the gap. On this occasion, her name was Esther. Mordecai sent to her a copy of the king's edict and urged her to go to the king on behalf of her people. He knows if she acts on this, it could be curtains for her. At present, no one in the palace knows she's Jewish. If she believes the information Mordecai has given her and acts on it, she is risking everything, including her life. Although the king was her husband, she couldn't just stroll into his office and casually unload what was on her mind. Things didn't work like that in ancient Persia. He had to send for her. And at that time, he hadn't sent for her for a month. If she went to him without being summoned, he could have her put to death. And top of all, that she was Jewish. Who knows how he would respond when he found that out? It was a huge dilemma. Mordecai's response to this was, first of all, if you do nothing, don't think you will escape death. Being a Jew, you will die like the rest of us. And second, even if we die, God is not limited to you or me, nor will he allow his people to perish. He will use someone to save our nation. And then third, how great it would be if he sovereignly chose you to use you. Could it be that this explains why you were chosen to be queen for such a time as this? For this very moment? This is motivation at its best. Mordecai is telling Esther, this is your finest hour. Stand, speak, die, but whatever you do, don't be silent. Esther shows her true colors, and they are brilliantly bold. Her words reveal enormous faith mixed with courage. Go assemble all the Jews who are found in Susa, and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my maidens will also fast in the same way. And thus I will go to the king, which is not according to the law. And if I perish, I perish. Is that a great answer or what? Is this a great woman? She's had only a few moments to consider what Mordecai had told her. A brief slice of time to weigh his counsel. It was all she needed. She is determined to make a difference, no matter what the consequences to her personally. If I perish, I perish. If a guard drives a sword through my body, I die doing the right thing. She has changed from fear to abandonment and faith, from hesitation to confidence and determination, from concern for her own safety to concern for her people's survival. She has reached her own personal hour of decision and has not been found wanting. Think of the patience Esther must have had to refrain from telling the king right away about Haman, when she had him in the very palm of her hand. Think of the patience she had to wait for just the right time. Timing is everything. In situations that are unpleasant, timing is as important as action, sometimes more so. Pace yourself. Have patience. Wait for the situation to become bearable and workable. Amazing things happen to our courage while we're waiting. Rather than getting more fearful, we become less fearful. Rather than losing heart, we gain confidence. Life is filled with sustained periods of silence, but those periods of God's silence are just as significant as the time when he speaks. During those times, we need to have ears of faith to listen for his voice. Don't ever try to convince yourself that some situation in this life is absolutely permanent. I'd like to share a personal story with you. Back in 1979, 80, early 81, God laid salvation upon my heart. I didn't know at the time what was really happening. I didn't know all about this business of salvation or what to do, but I was just being nagged, and I was thinking, well, I've got to change things in my life. I've got to clean up my act, because God is not going to take me just as I am. So I started that. We went to church every Sunday morning. I took the children to Sunday school in the afternoon, and quite often I went to church Sunday nights. But at some point, this conviction was just tormenting me so much, and I guess I was fearful. I said one night after I came home from church, that's it. I'm not going to church anymore Sunday night. Because in my way of thinking, the only time and place you got saved was Sunday night in church. So I figured if I didn't go, I was safe. All these feelings would go away and I'd be at peace and everything would be good. But that's not what happens, is it? I took the children to Sunday school that afternoon. I came back home. And when I got in the house, I was so tormented. I was so agitated. I was just in a terrible way. And the only way to get relief was to fall on my knees and give my heart to the Lord. And that's what I did that Sunday afternoon. And I went back to church that night, and I made the commitment publicly. But you know, I found out, and I guess all of you do know as well, you can't hide from God. And you can't run away from God. No heart is so stubborn that God cannot penetrate it. He can change any heart. Any heart. No will is so determined that he cannot break through it whenever he so desires. No one, no matter who and no matter how powerful, is a match for the living God. No barrier is too high. No chasm is too wide for him, because he is not limited by space or time. If we want to know the day, or the month, or the year, or the century, we look at the calendar. If we want to know the hour, or minute, or the seconds, we merely look at our watch. God is not like that at all. He lives and moves outside the realm of earthly time, beyond the ticking of our clocks, beyond the turning of our calendar. He is all-powerful. And when God is ready to move, he moves. And when he does, hang on. You're in for the ride of your life. You see, in the end, God wins. His plan prevails. When God wins, the people he uses are often unexpected. Remember the shepherd boy chosen to be king? If you wanted to lead an exodus of 2 million people out of Egypt, would you have chosen an 80-year-old man with murder on his record? Would you have chosen a former Christian-hating Pharisee to model grace and to write most of the New Testament? Would you have chosen a man who denied Jesus 3 times as the major spokesman for the early church? When it came time for God to send his Son to earth, would you have chosen an unwed mother, a virgin, who lived in the lowly village of Nazareth? Where do you find yourself today? To what small kingdom has God brought you for such a time as this? You may be in a tough spot on a path bristling with problems. The load seems too heavy to continue carrying. These factors may be the very reasons God put you where you are and not someone else with less strength or less understanding. Perhaps he has put you where you are because he knows you can be trusted to see your task through with honor. God's name never appears in the entire book of Esther. His actions do. His thoughts do. His plan does. His fingerprints are on every page, but his name never appears. Could it be that God is more concerned about getting the job done than getting recognized? God works in people like you and me. In every generation of every year. We live our lives under the careful, loving, gracious, albeit sovereign hand of God. And the movements of time and history tick off according to his reckoning, exactly as he ordained. Esther's story may be ancient, but it lives on, doesn't it? And how beautifully the Lord steps in to make things right, just when he was needed the most. He's never late, but he does seem to delay his involvement longer than we would prefer. And in the end, never forget, he wins. Whether you believe it or not, God wins. Whether you accept it or not, God wins. Whether you even return to him in repentance, God wins. Whether you know before him, whether you bow before him as Savior or not, Lord, God still wins.